Madam President, we are grateful to Najat Roshdi, Joyce Masuya, and Amne Kulani for their briefings. Madam President, Israel's military misadventures continue to exacerbate the situation throughout the Middle East. The new wave of tensions in the context of the Iranian-Israeli confrontation generates risks not only for Syria and its peaceful citizens, who have borne the brunt of the protracted humanitarian and economic crisis for many years. Dragging this country into the quagmire of regional conflict threatens to fuel centrifugal tendencies in the SAR, which needs to be avoided at all costs. What is also inadmissible is the use of Syrian airspace or territory by third parties. Since the last meeting of the Council on Syria, all the challenges facing the country remain relevant. There has been a significant increase in the risks of resumption of large-scale terrorist activity, including by ISIL affiliate groups. We expect Damascus to undertake robust measures to combat terrorism and address the situation with foreign terrorist fighters. It is essential that, as a result of the transformation of the Syrian security forces, the country's army and police are staffed exclusively by professional personnel with untainted track records. Not only will this ensure the trust of the local population, but also shape Syria's image abroad. In this connection, we welcome the release in recent months of hundreds of former army officers due to the absence of legal grounds for their continued detention. Such actions by Damascus reflect its genuine commitment to intra-Syrian reconciliation and its willingness to put the national interests above the interests of certain groups. We believe that leveraging the capability of hundreds of thousands of military personnel who took the oath of allegiance before December 2024 is something that will benefit the Syrian state and help avoid the tragic mistakes made when many officers from the Saddam era were sidelined and then raised the black flag of ISIL. The matter of Israeli violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity remains on the agenda. We call on Israel to immediately revert back to stringent compliance with the 1974 Disengagement Agreement and to withdraw from the buffer zone and the adjacent territories, as well as to cease shelling Syria. The Israeli actions can hardly be justified by claims about eliminating security threats emanating from Syrian, given that Damascus has been continuously broadcasting its intention to peacefully coexist with all of its neighbors without exception. We are convinced that any emerging issues can and must be resolved through dialogue. Madam President, tensions also persist in the south of the country. We note the implementation of provisional agreements between Damascus and the Druze on ensuring security by local law enforcement agencies. Despite sporadic outbreaks of violence in the northeast, the agreement between the central authorities and the Trans-Euphrates is being essentially observed. The situation is exceedingly volatile in Latakia and Tartus provinces, with the levels of instability and security threats remaining high. This is clearly illustrated by the recent tragic events, which resulted in massive casualties among civilians, primarily among Alawites. Thousands of families were forced to flee their homes. Some of them have found temporary refuge in Lebanon, others at the Russian airbase in Hamimim and in other regions of Syria. We look forward to the results of the national investigation into the events that took place on the West Coast, bringing all those responsible to justice, irrespective of their status and affiliation, will prove that the new Syrian authorities are really committed to the rule of law. Overall, hundreds of thousands of Syrians in coastal areas remain in dire need of humanitarian assistance. We once again call on OCHA to pay heightened attention to the situation in Latakia and Tartus. We are convinced that the new UN humanitarian architecture in Syria needs to take into account the specific nature of what is happening in these regions and have the necessary resources to promptly respond to crisis situations. Madam President, the data shared today clearly demonstrate that the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely dire and is far from being resolved. It is exacerbated by both the consequences of the protracted armed conflict and the profound socio-economic crisis, which is being fueled by the practice of imposing unilateral sanctions. We view the most recent messages about the partial lifting or easing of these illegitimate restrictive measures by the US, the EU, and the UK as a step in the right direction. At the same time, we would like to emphasize that such decisions should have been taken much earlier, so that the Syrian people could have exercised their legitimate right to development. Yet another blow to the residents of the country is dealt by extreme weather conditions. According to UN estimates, Syria is experiencing its worst drought in decades. Up to 75% of the wheat harvest is under threat. Amid the drastic underfunding of humanitarian operations, it will be extremely difficult for the international community to offset such losses if there is no harvest in the country. Moreover, the onset of summer heat increases the risk of infectious diseases spreading. UN agencies should be ready to tackle these challenges and take preventive and anticipatory measures for risk reduction. As far as we understand, OSA has the relevant capabilities and it can harness to this end various financial instruments, including the UN Central Emergency Response Fund. There is another persistent serious threat, namely mine contamination, which poses a direct threat to the lives of civilians, impedes humanitarian operations, and complicates the safe return of forcibly displaced persons. We note with alarm that since December of last year, 400 people have been victimized by unexploded ordnance. 1/3 of them are children. It is essential that the Syrian government and specialized international agencies need to step up their efforts in clearing mines and raising awareness. We highly appreciate the efforts of UN humanitarian agencies in Syria aimed at saving people's lives. We believe that what is particularly needed in the current circumstances are food assistance programs and efforts to restore health and water supply sectors. At the same time, we are very much concerned by the underfunding for the UN humanitarian appeal. There has been received only about 13% of the $2 billion requested for the period from January to June 2025. The lack of resources is already generating grave consequences. What is crucial right now is to consolidate the efforts by donors and the international community. We cannot allow millions of Syrians to be left without support at such a critical juncture. Madam President, we advocate a political process with the involvement of all ethnic and religious groups and minorities in Syria, with the support from the United Nations and in accordance with the key provisions of Security Council Resolution 2254. We view this process as a linchpin for the restoration of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. As next steps along this path, we expect an interim parliament to be formed and a draft constitution to be crafted by the Constitutional Committee. We reaffirm our support for the efforts of UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen. We expect that further international support for intra-Syrian dialogue will be inclusive in nature. Syria and its resilient people have traveled their path, surmounting the most challenging trials with dignity, and despite it all, they have preserved their faith in a better future and remained committed to constructive engagement with the international community. They deserve our concerted support. For our part, we intend to establishing fruitful cooperation with Syria and provide its people and government with the necessary support to overcome the difficulties of the transitional period. Thank you.